What I try to argue is that for many of the communities I look at who enjoy little political capital, so the bazaar trader, unlike the big Marwari capitalist or the big Parsi capitalist, might have his personal networks in the local party, but he doesn't have a kind of standing to speak out in the wider public. And in a way, converting this economic issue into a question of technical administrative regulation allows them to poke holes and spokes in the government policy more effectively than taking it on full strength, which I think would have been hard to do given the kind of things existing at the time.
Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and today my guest is Rohit De, who is an associate professor of history at Yale University. His recent book, A People's Constitution, The Everyday Life of Law in the Indian Republic, is an excellent look at how the Constitution actually transformed the daily lives of citizens in profound and lasting ways. Rohit details how those on the margins of society, like butchers and prostitutes or drinkers and traders, made claims using the Constitution after India's founding and shaped India's constitutional culture. I had a chance to speak with Rohit about the 4 cases he details in the book. The 3,000 Qureshis from the butcher community in the face of a ban on cow slaughter, Husna Bai, the prostitute, Harishankar Bagla, the Marwari cotton trader carrying excess cotton without a permit, and Behram Pesi Kaka, a middle-aged Parsi drinker drinking without a permit during Prohibition in Bombay. We talked about how these individuals asserted their rights against an oppressive, regulatory and socialist state that had criminalized their daily activities and infringed on their ability to carry on their profession. We also had a chance to talk about Indian constitutionalism, economic planning and controls during Nehruvian socialism, the meaning of constitutional franchise, constitutional symbolism during the citizenship amendment protests in India, Rohit's intellectual journey, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. One of the fundamental things that Smith did was that he broke the link between superior outcomes and superior individuals. The wealth of nations is not because of wealthy people, right? It's because of the division of labor and specialization. And I found that was something very similar to the overall theme of your book, which is that for constitutional vibrancy and robustness, especially in terms of protecting individual rights and civil liberties, we don't just need elites who are familiar with constitutional debates and doctrines and foreign constitutions. What we actually need is just ordinary people going about their lives in business who are willing to fight for their right to be free from interference of the state or interference from other groups. And so I wanted to ask you about, is this how you framed or thought of the project, or is this me making a very big leap and imposing my economist Adam Smith lens on this?
No, thank you so much for the question, Shruti. So when I started the project, I was fresh out of, I think, 6 years of legal education. And I had a very instinctive idea that naturally the law and the constitution are important. These are sort of obvious places that people will turn to. And, when you talk about this with some lawyers, they're like, yes, of course, people who are shut out of power will turn to courts. It's sort of seen as a kind of instinctive reaction. But when I started looking at the material, it was clear that the turn to law and to litigation, the use of constitutional language was not automatic. It was made possible by certain structural conditions, social networks, at a particular historical moment. And as you will see from the book, I started looking for what I just thought were individual rights claims, or more broadly, places where the new independent Indian government was seeking to transform everyday life and sort of where the challenges came. And they all seem to be rooted in a certain kind of changing market regulation or market practice. So there are strong parallels to the time that Smith is talking about, which is the kind of creation of a commercial society, commercial ethics in the UK and Britain in the late 18th century. The idea that for the wealth of nations, that you need to have the ability of consumption amongst middling to lower classes as well. This is not just about, unless you have the ability to consume, which is more widespread, you don't have a kind of forward movement of a market society. And a lot of what came through were really conflicts around consumption and conflicts around small-time retail and distribution, which often gets overlooked in sort of standard economic histories that are written of this period. So at its heart, and I talk about it a little bit in the book, is really a set of competing visions about the market. And where a lot of these rights languages come from or procedural debates come from are really about contested notions of how the market should be imagined and regulated in the 1950s.
There is a lot of Marxist subtext in the book, in the sense that you do talk about, group identity and class-based interests of different groups. And that will become apparent in the cases we discuss, whether it's the Marwadis and, their long tradition of usury, or whether it is the Parsis and the liquor trade and the Qurayshis who are the butchers and so on. But in one sense, you also sort of subvert this standard Marxist lens, because you very clearly show that this is not really a class warfare, right? This is the state regulating commercial society and using such excessive force that it actually just cuts across all classes. It hurts farmers, right? It hurts Husnabai, who's the prostitute. It hurts, all the petty bourgeoisie, the traders. And it also hurts some very long-lived, traditional, customary trades that we have in India.
If I can do a little bit of a segue, much of the writing on Nehruvian India at the time when I started doing the book was mostly by political scientists and to some extent economists who were really interested in sort of macro stories of change. So I'm thinking here of the work of Shriyuta Kaviraj on the kind of class-based nature of the state, or the sort of standard economic histories which begin with the first plan, second plan, and sort of list it out. And I think what historical research or archival research shows is sort of more granular stories that have more to do with contingency and to do with fixed locations rather than these overarching India stories. So a couple of things came through. One is there was a long-standing idea that, and this comes from a range of not just left, but like critical historical traditions, which saw law as external to Indian society. Law was a kind of tool of the colonial state. It's a kind of, Upendra Bakshi described it as a state's emissary. And the idea is that the law essentially is a manifestation of the interests of a certain kind of ruling class. And the ruling class composition might change over time, but really, it's really a story of coercion that is coming through. And other people have shown this as well. But I think what the 50s archive shows is that actually, one, that it had a certain degree of partial autonomy. And secondly, that it became not sort of just a one-way process, but a terrain on which a lot of competing visions could be argued. And there was a period of time when multiple visions, it was not clear which one would win. I think the point that you make about how state regulation cuts across classes is an important one. So we've often, in older, more partisan debates, either seen this as, a kind of conservative defense of right to property, which is siding with landowners and Maharajas, and a kind of progressive siding on land reforms with the government. But one is that, we now know that property expropriation happened primarily with groups who had loosely defined property rights, so tribals, landless farmers, the urban poor. We also know that outside of just physical property, there were lots of different kinds of interventions that the state was doing in the 50s. So what you have is a government that's sort of trying to do some of these things, but keeping both the kind of election-winning goals in mind, but also being curbed in by this constitutional system. And I think it's interesting that because our economy is structured so much around a kind of caste society, that a lot of interventions into, say, economic behavior also began to have consequences on identity, on group identities, right? So there's a kind of way in which we want to reduce certain things as class conflict and certain things as, say, religion or ethnicity conflict. And it's one of the tired tropes that we hear in all kinds of politics, like, by bringing up identity questions, you're weakening the kind of class battle, or identity issues don't address economic inequality. So I think when you look at India, they both go strongly hand in hand. So say an intervention by the government to restrict cow slaughter has been traditionally understood as a kind of point of Hindu-Muslim conflict, but it's really about also attacking a kind of economic activity of certain Muslim and Hindu castes who are very much dependent on this trade. So these can't be easily disentangled. And it helps us break down the kind of old elite, marginalized sort of category that we've often worked with.
Now that you've brought up the issue of caste and identity so deeply correlated with trade and profession, I wanted to examine especially the Qureshi case and so on from that lens and get your take on a few things. One thing that became very clear to me when I read Qureshi, and for the listeners, this is the Qureshi community. For the really young listeners, this is the Qureshis from the gangs of Wasipur. For those who are legally trained, this is the Mohammad Hanif Qureshi case from 1955. And it's sort of like India's first class action suit in a sense, because it's 3,000 butchers from a dozen different states who come together and who really fight for their right to livelihood against almost complete ban on cow slaughter, right? So that's sort of the impetus for this particular suit. And they lose the case for various reasons, but they center themselves, Rohit, as you discuss in the book, as this is a question of Qureshis, the butchers, right? Not Qureshis, the Muslims. So for them, their livelihood and their identity as a caste that is involved in butchering specifically large animals, which is the Kasai trade, is center stage. Whereas the way the Supreme Court justices and even some of the High Court justices look at this problem is through a sectarian lens. They immediately bring in the question of religion under Article 25, which is actually the last of the issues mentioned by the petitioners. And there's a fundamental misunderstanding by the Hindu upper caste judges. They think all slaughter is the same, right? Or rather, all butchers are exactly the same. They don't live in the Adam Smith world of division of labor and specialization. So they say, okay, so you can't butcher cows. So of course you can butcher something else, like you can butcher other meat and you can butcher chicken So it's a really bizarre way of looking at the problem. My sense is a lot of this could have just been avoided if we had a very strong protection under Article 19(1)(g), which is the right to practice trade, profession, occupation, and business. But it seems to me that that right was never meaningfully upheld because the courts kept deferring to both the legislature and the executive's ability to unleash economic planning at a national level. And because a lot of those exemptions in previous cases, including a complete prior ban on private motor transport, for instance, in those kinds of cases, because the court had already said that public interest allows for this kind of national planning and development, now they were suddenly in a really bizarre spot when it came to the question of, Qureshi community and the question of their livelihood. And then they turned to this kind of sectarian sort of, how do we think about this problem? What are the rights of the Qureshis? Eventually, they have a weasel way out, which is this economic question of which cows are productive and unproductive. Huge discussion on this in a Supreme Court case. But to me, it feels like the entire matter could have been solved very differently.
So the Indian constitutional vision was never one of unchecked private autonomy. And I think that also came from a recognition that society in India was deeply unequal and hierarchical. And it wasn't just coming from, it's an interesting coalition of people who come together. So it's not just the socialists, but also, say, Arya Samaji, Brahmo Samaji, progressive Hindu reformers who want to sort of modernize Hinduism, women's rights activists who are concerned about deep gender equality in the society, groups that are, involved in sort of scientific rationality, conservative groups who are concerned about morality. So, there is a kind of coalition that sort of seems to agree that there is a legitimate interest in the state in intervening in certain domains of what one would call liberal sphere. And they come together. And that's why the debates are interesting, because they come together with a particular kind of textual formation, which they believe will allow for some freedom, but provide some restrictions. So I think the problem with cow slaughter runs in 3 or 4 different ways. So one is a successful political narrative that goes back to the 19th century, which constantly frames the question of cow slaughter as an identity question, which is at complete odds with actually the role that the cow plays in agriculture and everyday economic life. So, right from the 19th century, we see campaigns to sort of protect the cow and fairly aggressive campaigns. But this is in a situation where almost every farmer who owns a cow knows that at a certain point in time, that cow has to be disposed of to allow them to buy a fresh cow. Or to any kind of animal husbandry, you want a kind of reverse sex selection in how you produce cattle. And there is a kind of everyday sense of the cow as an economic asset, but a public sense of a cow as a sort of religious marker. And what happens in this case is that you see the two visions come from two different sides. And if it's the Qureshi's caste identity that makes the economic question visible, it's in some ways the judges, almost all upper caste Hindu judges, caste blindness that doesn't let them see exactly what you're pointing out, that this is not just any activity that the group is doing. These are things that they can't just move into other professions, or that the cow has a kind of economic value beyond its role in just agriculture, whether it's towards leather industry, whether it's towards just giving the farmer certain kinds of assets at the end when you sort of sell the cow off. This is not just true for upper caste judges, but also a lot of the Muslim political leadership which signs on to the cow slaughter bill belong to sort of elite ashraf groups for whom this is not a question of livelihood. It is primarily a question of identity and maybe diet. And they're willing to make a compromise at this point of time, but the Qurayshis are not. So again, we see kind of reducing groups into Hindu and Muslim doesn't actually represent a full range of interests. But there is a structural problem that the Qureshi case illustrates, which is that Supreme Court is not a court that can do fact-finding by itself. It is very reliant. So unlike in a sort of ordinary trial court where you can summon witnesses, you can cross-examine evidence provided by the other side, the Supreme Court as an appellate court doesn't have the mechanism to do this. So this is the first case where they even ask someone to produce an amicus brief, and the person they appoint as an amicus is the strongest cow protectionist in the assembly. So it produces a certain kind of knowledge, but there's no ability for the opposing lawyer to challenge the amicus brief in the court itself. There's sort of no process of taking in expert advice on a number of questions. And I think that's something that the case makes visible as a problem in constitutional design.
Yeah, I wasn't so much asking for your opinion on a sort of a laundry list on when the court should intervene or not. It was more, maybe I should rephrase this. To me, in one sense, we have constitutionalized religious identity, caste identity, and sectarianism in a very peculiar way. On the one hand, at the birth of the Republic, we're trying to annihilate caste, right? And we're trying to rise above sectarian differences by creating a scaffolding of liberal constitutional principles with Article 14 and right to equality front and center. On the other hand, the way the problems are navigated is through this group identity politics. And to me, I'm trying to wonder if there is a way to avoid that constitutionally. Does right to trade and under 19(1)(g) give you the strong weapon that one needs to avoid this problem of constitutionalizing group identity?
Right. I think I understand your question better. Now, in this way, I think I perhaps disagree with some of my colleagues who write about sort of the early constitutional ideas, that I don't think that the Indian liberal formation, or if you want to call it that, was necessarily one which sought to be blind to social conditions. I think it did provide mechanisms, particularly procedural mechanisms, for reducing the impact it played. But I don't think it was blind to questions of identity. And it's just the politics of that time. Many of these identities were critical to sort of just self-imagination, but also how groups organized. So let's see what a more deference to an article right to print profession would have been. It would have, again, allowed for certain kinds of professions that are dominated by castes and groups to continue in their form and in a way reify those identities as well. Another way of reading this would be that in some ways, governmental intervention breaks down traditional monopolies over professions, right? And in some ways, this could be progressive when there are professions that people are forced into because of caste hierarchies, right? So they're coming in and intervening in that. I hesitate to take a unilateral answer on this, but I think what I want to suggest that a lot of what looks like liberal individualistic politics is very much tied to a range of other identities, and we can't sort of think of them as separate boxes. They work together. Ordinarily, the kind of places where these are seen as breaking down is with industrialization on the factory workflow, in the union, in the cities. But we have a range of historical anthropological scholarship that shows that in India, even things like trade unions or urban spaces continue to reproduce a lot of dynamics of social identity groups that exist earlier. They are not transforming into some kind of unmarked worker or unmarked trader just because they're participating in a kind of modern manufacturing system.
Yes and no. So to me, what has happened in this kind of sectarian politics, if we just follow the thread on just this cow slaughter business, right? We move from talking about, once the cows start aging, then we need to make some concessions and we need to allow cow slaughter, things like that. Eventually in India, we move towards a complete ban on cow slaughter, right? So that's one kind of drift that takes place from Hanif Qureshi. Another kind of drift that takes place is now the matter is seen entirely from a sectarian lens. So, I'm talking about cases like Om Prakash in 2004, where there is a complete ban on sale of eggs in Rishikesh because it's a spiritual city and apparently every member in the city is committed to. In Gujarat, you see a prohibition on slaughter put in place for the Navratri days, right? And then people start lobbying for why only Navratri, can it extend to other days and so on. So I do understand your point of even if the court had not taken this view, it's not like we could have just eliminated group identities overnight. These were things that went on for centuries. But on the other hand, maybe the way we resolve the dispute is not through the lens of identity. So there is that element that I find very disturbing. And I think in modern day politics, it is particularly disturbing because it has now become a whitewashed Hindu versus Muslim, upper caste versus meat-eating Dalit. It's kind of taken that really bizarre, abstract form.
So I think that's a great way to sort of frame this. So I want to just say a couple of things. One is that a lot of the cases that you mentioned, the geographical bans on diet and other kinds of practice, I think are fairly recent in the last 20 years in terms of history. In the earlier period, there were attempts to do this, mostly through municipalities. And there was pushback at the state government level to these regulations. There were legal challenges. And I'm sure some of this was enforced extra legally, but it was hard to do this through law. So the Qureshi judgment is interesting because when you read the judgment, almost anyone who would identify as pro-minority rights or don't want the question of cow slaughter to terrible religion would say it's a terrible judgment, it harms minority rights. But if you read the kind of cow protectionist reports on the judgment, they also say it's a terrible judgment, it doesn't protect the cow, right? So it's a sort of judgment which all sides seem to argue is not doing enough. And so who is it serving? And why do the cow protectionists have a problem with it? Is that, as you mentioned, it seems to be a hyper-technical question where they basically say you can't have an absolute ban, but you have to allow for uneconomic cattle to be slaughtered in the interests of agricultural productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes the way through which these markets continue. So you have about 30 years of litigation by cow protectionists until the meaning of the economic value of cattle is changed in a 2005 Supreme Court case. And once again, because the Supreme Court does not bring in evidence to be challenged, the court relies on Government of Gujarat Agricultural Ministry report, which basically says the value of cow dung and cow urine and all these sort of these things outweigh any kind of loss that it might cause. It's really a story of, because the law and litigation becomes important, there's a concerted effort to capture the legal narrative. So that's the first bit. The second bit I think that you're saying is really interesting, right? How do we, clearly recognizing we live in a society with identity politics, how do we allow for a non-identitarian spaces to be created? And I think the solution here is more than right a profession to really think about the idea of public and public space and who enters public space. Some of this has sort of constitutional backing when we think of the meanings under Article 15. And I think one of the underappreciated things, so Kalpana Kannabiran and Gautam Bhatia have talked about it, is really, it's one of the few provisions which is aimed at non-state entities as well. So it's not just about what the state can do, but also putting on watch public places, shops, restaurants, and an extension. And many of these judgments that we're thinking of are really about narrowing or closing off the idea of the public. So I think we need to have a larger conversation which emphasizes that public participation needs to allow for access of all kinds of groups and interests, and it cannot be dominated by just the views of a particular group.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I'm not very optimistic because we don't even allow that in a private space. This could also be held true of the private space in a common law sense where the only objection can be nuisance or extreme danger or something like that. And we don't even allow for that. So I'm even less optimistic of the kind of imagination that you have of public spaces.
I kind of see there's a spike in litigation against the state. But what we also see is there's a real drop in civil litigation. So individuals and communities are less likely to take other individuals' communities to court. And the numbers have been dropping since the 1920s. And we don't have a very good explanation for it beyond the fact that it's a long, drawn out, corrupt, slow system. While there's much to be criticized in the American kind of torts approach, the complete absence of torts in India means that it's very difficult it means that for anything to be done, you have to bring the state in as a party, right? And so instead of having a kind of nuisance case with your neighbor, you basically go to the state and say, just ban it in the entire city. And, I'm not an economist and you guys study incentives better, but it seems to me that this creates a particularly perverse set of incentives. And I think much broader impact of particular wins of interest than what could have been resolved through private litigation.
Absolutely. And I think the other part is because we have an absence of class action suits, public interest litigation is basically our idea of a class action suit, right? Which it really is not. And Anuj Bhuvania and I had a lovely discussion about that. But this idea of getting a group together to form representation and show that they have standing, we've just completely moved past that. And anyone for any reason can go to the state and just ask for either entitlements or encroachments, and sometimes they're the same. Some entitlements are encroachments on other people. So we've had over the years, we've really made all law public law in a sense. And you're right that we don't have much private law, which I think is a travesty because local conditions, Hindu-Muslim relationships are not the same everywhere. I mean, in Eastern UP and Western UP, they are different, right? In Kerala, they are completely different from Bihar. And we've made this sort of like a national blanket. This is your group, this is your identity, and this is how your position is fixed vis-a-vis other groups. And this sort of public version or making everyone's identity unilateral, national, public, I think is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons we have the politics that we have today. This kind of monolithic rise of Hindu nationalism. So to go back, I really want to talk a bit about what you call the case of excess baggage. This is, of course, Marwari cotton traders who get caught with more cotton than is permitted. Of course, they never got the permits in the first place in this particular case, but whatever the legal limit is, they carry way more than that. And they are basically charged and eventually, we assume, imprisoned and fined for trading cotton, right? So there are a few things going on here. So one, you have a beautiful description of how all these price and commodity controls came in during British wartime. And they were just sort of adopted in post-colonial India. And what is really surprising is that the post-colonial version is so much harsher than the colonial version, which may have been justified as a war effort, but now it's losing all justification. I was really surprised by the time I got to the end of the chapter. I know you're not an economist, but you literally list out every single unintended consequence of price and quantity controls that I teach in my principles microeconomics class, right? So you talk about shortages and rationing, black markets, hoarding, everything that we normally talk about, how the prices actually don't drop. There is a skyrocketing of price because new supply is not forthcoming. In worst cases, they lead to famines. So you literally detail every single one of them. But at the end of it, you are still really sort of benign about this Nehruvian commodity and industrial licensing scheme. The sense I walked away when I read the entire section was that all of these things happen, but hey, wait a minute, there was this larger thing going on, which was, national economic planning. And that's why they did this. And you sort of leave us in lurch there. So I was expecting a much harsher criticism, given the kinds of horrifying excesses that you pointed out. So I just wanted your view on, are there things you held back? Are there other cases that you read which made you more favorable to this kind of Nehruvian planning? Like, what is going on in that narrative?
So thank you. I mean, this is also, maybe the first thing I should say is that I was so surprised to find the commodity controls cases because when you read sort of accounts of planning and critiques of planning, what they largely talk about is either industrial controls or sort of investment controls, right? So these are really focusing at big industry. And commodity controls perhaps is mentioned, but if you kind of look through secondary literature, there's maybe like one book from the 50s, something in the 70s, and the work being done by, I think, Mekhala Krishnamurthy today, right? So it's fairly under-researched as the topic. And what is really surprising, it's under-researched despite being such an important part of political conversation and sort of everyday life.
The only place I have found this is the lectures given at Forum of Free Enterprise and all the Swatantra Party leaders and those guys.
And they were one of the archives I consulted as well. And I think that became one of the few sites of economic policy critique on controls, because in the 40s, the Gandhians were against controls. In fact, this is one of the things that Gandhi was like sort of adamantly against. The Congress very narrowly won the battle they had inner party democracy in those days. They very narrowly won the battle to keep controls on. The socialists and the left were ambiguously critical about controls because they could see the consequences. They just felt the controls should be run differently. So I think one of the ways to understand it is that the wartime experience of controls, and this is like a lot of the criticism of British legislation, right? So for the Congress and the early leaders, they saw the problem not in the tools that the British government used, but one, the non-representative character of the British government, which means they didn't reflect the interests of the people they were governing. And this comes out most clearly in the Bengal famine, where despite the existence of controls, famine conditions actually exacerbated. And secondly is the idea that a lot of the British economic controls are meant to subordinate Indian economy in the interest of something else. So the initial reaction in the debates and in the parliamentary reports is that, look, yes, there's been critique of controls, but the problem with this has been that the controls were used to serve British interests, and there was no linkage in society, so they didn't get information filters and things coming in. I think, and this is people like Will Gold have pointed out, that what implementing the controls required was a massive upgradation of state capacity, incorporation of a lot of new people in the bureaucracy. And in many cases, state capacity and the bureaucrats were not either independent or equipped enough to actually do the kind of regulation that they wanted to. So you had the existence of a wide sort of black market. I am trying to imagine what the alternative would have been. And to be honest, when I look around other post-colonial states, I don't necessarily see a significantly improved or better alternative that emerges in terms of what is available in a set of ideas. So with the exception of maybe the Forum people, it's not as if any other political party in India is making a kind of alternative radical proposal on how to deal with these questions. Everybody agrees that there is a problem of distribution and prices in the country, and this is the mechanism to solve it. So, I mean, Swatantra Party is interesting because I think post 1991, there's been this deep nostalgia for Swatantra, which is supposed to be this sort of both liberal in socially and liberal economically, despite actually winning MPs being fairly regressive Maharajas who win in their own territory. So there's also a kind of gap between their intellectual leadership and their actual leaders. But Swatantra operates within a fairly limited world where the ideas only have so much reach. And there's a reason for that, which is that it's a society that's come out of mass deprivation, from partition, from war. There's a need to make resources available. It's not clear what other mechanisms exist at that point of time.
You know, I'm not surprised that at the time they had this huge socialist infrastructure, because I've written about this in other places. There was a very clear move away from laissez-faire, right, in the early 20th century. And you have sort of, the commanding heights of the Soviet Union and a number of now Eastern European countries who are doing this. And at that time, even though Hayek and Mises had written a very clear critique, it was still not as obvious as it is today that this kind of price control exercise only leads to famine, right? So we have no success stories from central planning in that sense, right? What I'm genuinely surprised by is the lack of experimentation. So, except for, to my mind, the one instance when Rajagopalachari enters politics in Madras presidency after his term as Governor General, he becomes the Chief Minister of Madras, and one of the first executive orders that he issues is abolishing price controls on food grains, which was introduced as a temporary wartime measure. And the opposition is communist, right? That's the biggest opposition to him in Madras at that point in time. And they keep saying that, hey, we're going to have a famine, prices are going to increase. But exactly as any economist would predict, the moment you eliminate price controls, supply is more forthcoming and the markets adjust and the shortages go away. My question to you is, do you have a thesis on why there wasn't more experimentation in different places? Because I know that the UP contingent was much more supportive of traders, same with Gujarat, whereas some of the other states, say, West Bengal and Kerala, were much more left-leaning. So this kind of blanket, the same version repeated everywhere, is this coming from Nehruvian tendencies to centralize, or is just all of India socialist at that time?
So again, I hesitate using the word socialist, but what you identified, right? There's a set of common goals and methods that cut across groups which would have very different ideologies. So the older version of the Hindu Mahasabha, the Praja Socialist Party, the Congress, almost all of them seem to sort of center on very similar kinds of methods. And while controls are massively criticized, from what I could see, a lot of the critique is not that controls by themselves in the 50s are bad, but they're being implemented badly because of individual politicians, these crooked businessmen. So the critique, and it's a popular critique, is really focused on implementation and not in the policy itself. The final one is, actually, there is a fairly close relationship between business and political groups in all states, including in the left-ruled states. So by the time the Communist parties start coming to power, local business communities in all these states sort of begin to work with the ruling parties. And what often happens is not that necessarily policies change, but the tolerance from deviance of policy goes up, right? So there are controls, and we all know you're selling outside of the control price, but we're just not going to go and look. And I think in the Bagla case, it's interesting that they're actually caught when they're crossing state lines. So, I mean, Mr. Bagla himself was a fairly influential figure in Kanpur, and maybe if he had just stayed there, this wouldn't have been an issue, right? So there is a large, I mean, in some ways, in the kind of economic, like the market has corrected itself because there's already a world that's functioning outside of the regulation. So the archive of this regulation actually shows us, in some cases, the worst instances. But I think the larger point you're getting to is interesting is that there isn't a wide purchase of a critique of this, which is rooted in a kind of a forum of free enterprise kind of critique. And I think that's partly a kind of deep recognition of the kind of economic and social inequalities India has, the recent memory of shortages, and that all the examples around the world, whether you look at sort of New Deal America or Soviet Russia, seem to have adopted some kind of centralized planning. The last bit about, why are the states experimenting? I think has to do, of course, with the centralizing drive of the constitution, but also to some extent a coordination within the Congress party on economic policy, at least up till the 70s, right? And I think in some ways we don't acknowledge the 1990s enough, where there was a kind of splintering of centralized political parties, but allowing for lots of very different kinds of policies to be followed by different states.
Yeah. And, the other aspect of this, so, one, I should clarify, when I meant socialism, I meant like literally in the Misesian sense, there is a control on means of production and the price system in the economy, right?
No, I also mean it in that sense, which is the sense that the state will intervene in economic activity. Yeah.
To me, one really interesting aspect of, partly driven by what I read as your benign reaction to what was going on, is, to me, what is not surprising now, given how I've read about post-socialist economies, is you have something like the Bombay Plan, right? Where all the industrialists, and this is also identity based, you have all your Parsis and Marwari families who come together and they say, yeah, socialism is a great idea, mainly because it imposes huge barriers to entry, right? And their monopoly within their own trades becomes entrenched. So we have a very monopoly cronyist version of socialism taking place simultaneously. But all the industrial licensing is intended towards them. But the people it affects the most are the Baglas, right? And people like the Baglas. And, this includes like farmers who are trying to sell their produce, right? Women trying to sell saris from their home. So the question I have is, was this not pointed out in these series of cases that this is really an upside down state, that nothing seems to be infringing on the people we're trying to control, which is prevention of very large enterprises. And we're really thwarting every kind of small enterprise?
Yeah, I think that again is a question of how issues get translated into legal questions. And in some ways, in almost all these cases, the questions turned not so much on whether the policy was good or not, but how was it implemented? Who made the rules? Did they have the authority to make the rules? Did they follow the kind of procedure the rulemaking involved? And at least from the legal archive, the critique was only limited to that. So the question wasn't whether the bureaucrat should do this or not, but was whether like the joint secretary had the power or the district magistrate had the power to issue the rules. So, I mean, Upendra Bakshi talks about this in a different context where he's actually arguing for more intervention, right? He says that basically what happens is the question of land reform, which really should be a political question about like whether the landless need like an economic resource to advance, gets entirely bogged down as to a debate about does the parliament have the right to amend the constitution and technicalities of it. And for him, he sees that this is reducing a kind of political power, which I think in that case is absolutely true. But what I try to argue is that for many of the communities I look at who enjoy little political capital, so the bazaar trader, unlike the big Marwari capitalist or the big Parsi capitalist, might have his like personal networks in the local party, but he doesn't have a kind of standing to speak out in the wider public. And in a way, converting this economic issue into a question of technical administrative regulation allows them to poke holes and spokes in the government policy more effectively than taking it on full strength, which I think would have been hard to do given the kind of things existing in the time. I just want to make a little bit of segue, which brings Yale and Hayek in as well. And it's interesting that the kind of legal resources that are given to lawyers to sort of mount these challenges stem from the Indian Law Institute, which is getting funding at this point of time by the Ford Foundation. And the first textbook in administrative law, which heavily uses the Bagla case and a bunch of other materials, also has extracts from Hayek, Road to Serfdom in it, and is written out of Yale Law School. So I think there is a clear investment that the Ford Foundation, the American government, has in trying to see India as a kind of non-China model for the developing world. And this is one of the places within the legal academy that they're trying to make an intervention. Its impact is limited, but significant because they're able to put a few things in those critical spaces.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the road to serfdom. When I was doing my dissertation work, I was talking about that kind of industrial planning. So I was talking about how there is this contradiction between what the Planning Commission is trying to do and what the Constitution aims to do. And every time there is this conflict, like Upen Bakshi mentioned, there is an amendment to the Constitution, right? And so we lose a lot of our civil and political liberties when the government is trying to come down hard on economic liberties. And that's really the crux of the Hayekian critique, right? You can't have political freedom if the government squashes economic freedoms harshly. But I was looking at this at the wide lens of industrial licensing regime, nationalization by Mrs. Gandhi and things like that. And what you point out in the book is, and that's why I told you the first time I read it, I was so depressed. It's really the road to serfdom in action through 1,000 paper cuts, right? Through this kind of administrative law and litigation, which is each one of these people, if you really think about it, I mean, they're trying to buy alcohol or they're trying to sell cotton, right? But the first half of the book is really talking about very ordinary activity, right? Women trying to have a drink on Sunday along with family dinner in South Bombay. And it's just so alarming at how much the state infringing on these kinds of economic freedoms and livelihoods just comes down on political freedoms, right? Do you have any view on this interaction between economic and civil liberties, or do you still see them as different legal and administrative questions?
No, I think they're deeply connected. And I think that even in how the claims are made or how they're regulated, they are. So, in some ways, to sort of separate the civil, political, and the economic is, I think, in the Indian context, somewhat disingenuous because they're deeply implicated. I think the issue isn't just the fact that economic rights can be regulated, but I think it's the excessive reliance on penal and coercive mechanisms to achieve these goals, right? And I don't think that's necessarily true in all situations. In many places, you're able to address both social and economic regulation without necessarily going through a system which empowers penal force against people concerned. So the campaign for prohibition was massively popular in the 30s and 40s. I mean, so much so that in the Constituent Assembly, I think there were just maybe two members, one of whom was a tribal representative who could even speak against prohibition. It had wide acceptability. When they had social movements for prohibition, it heavily impacted revenues. So if there's such a lot of, it unifies Hindus and Muslims, it brings women voters on board. So why is something so popular become so unpopular so quickly? And partly it's because Morarji decides to create this prohibition police force, right? Which is a massive recruitment of armed police who have the right to enter into private domains and implement this policy. Without warrants, I mean, I was looking at the numbers of people arrested and I kept thinking I'm reading the number of zeros wrong. But these are like 80, 90,000 of people a year who are arrested under this spec, almost none of whom get convicted because it's kind of almost impossible to prove. So for every person who's arrested, think of 5 other people who were harassed, probably made to pay some kind of a bribe and not arrested, right? So you're almost guaranteed like what might have been a popular policy becomes unpopular because they rely on a kind of police coerce mechanism to do it. And I think this gets replicated in almost every case, right? So, I mean, there are ways in which one can, even if a government is invested in animal rights or protecting this thing, can do it without making these non-bailable offenses or without sort of impinging on privacy of the home. And I think even when, for example, in the controls case, where there might have been a kind of popular narrative around it, it begins to fall down when it starts relying on an under-equipped undertrained police force to actually implement these. I think it might be worth actually having, and I'm not going to do this, a conversation about what other forms of regulation are possible without relying on criminal law.
No, and we criminalize everything. I recently wrote about a case that went on for 40 odd years where someone was adulteration of haldi and it had 3 worms in it or something like that. And you're absolutely right. We criminalize everything. To me, that's a natural consequence of the unintended consequence of price and quantity controls. In the sense, if you really want to come down hard on it, past a point, you keep making the penalties more and more severe as opposed to redesigning how to regulate markets altogether. The other odd thing about the prohibition case and also the prostitution case is the gaze, right? I mean, we constantly have a lot of discussion on who wrote the Constitution. It's mostly upper caste men. Of course, we have just over a dozen women, right?
Yeah, I mean, for its time, it was representative. In an ideal standard, obviously it wasn't.
Yeah, no, but I don't mean it from taking away the legitimacy or something like that. But even the women who are speaking for women have a completely different gaze because they are upper caste, they are modest, they are from homes where they don't necessarily have any kind of, need to earn a livelihood. Some of them are from royal families. And their view of women is to be paternalistic or maternalistic in this case, right? It is that we need to save the prostitutes from this situation. And what is remarkable about the cases that you mentioned in the last section of the book is Husna Bai just comes out in modern India, very early in the Republic, very unlike how women would behave at the time, and just says, I'm a prostitute and you have prevented me from doing my trade. So that to me is also a question of who is making these policies. We keep saying we're democratic, right? But are we really representing large numbers of people, their economic rights? Are we really representing most farmers who wish to drink at the end of a hard day's work, or women, minority as they may be, who wish to be prostitutes and things like that? So what is your view of democratic representation in this sense? Because this is a tension in the book, right, that you keep pointing out, that these things are democratically made by democratically elected people. It's no longer a colonial government imposing this on you, but the people are not so thrilled about it.
So, so I don't think we talk about this enough. So there is a kind of long-standing commitment in Indian political thought to have universal adult franchise and representation, right? As a theory, that sounds great. But when you start implementing in practice, it suddenly means that, for instance, Tarwars in Kerala are going to be regulated by votes that are cast in Uttar Pradesh, right? So suddenly, when you create a democratic public, the actual public is very different from the kind of imagined public. And to some extent, the framers are aware of it. So there are a variety of mechanisms in the Constitution itself, which seem to correct against awarding all of this authority to the parliament. But I think in the early years, it's a very difficult idea for the leaders of the national movement to grapple with, because these are clearly people who spent 20 to 30 years in political struggle in very difficult circumstances. They've clearly won elections with large majorities. They are, in their imaginations, doing what is best for the people. And I want to sort of, I found the chapter on sex work very hard to write because I was very sympathetic and a huge, after reading some of the work, fan of some of the women members in the assembly, many of whom, they might come from elite families, but had fairly dramatic, radical careers. They all married, either they were unmarried or they married men from other communities. They participated in public life. They were deeply suspicious of the Congress male establishment. And I also want to acknowledge that their view on how to regulate sex work is very different from that of the colonial administrators, for whom prostitution has to be regulated because it spreads disease. And also from the Indian men who come to power in the courts and parliament later on, for whom either it's a non-issue or it's this language of shame, dishonor, and disease. So one of the things that they're able to do very effectively is say that, look, prostitution is happening, and they sort of give 3 big reasons. One is because Indian family laws are regressive. They don't give women right to property. They don't allow them to leave unhappy marriages. There's no maintenance. So they link family law reform to prostitution. They link partition violence to prostitution, and they link economic causes to prostitution. So I think that's a kind of, for its time, a fairly radical approach to take. The problem is that they don't talk to women engaged in sex work themselves. And when they do, they don't know how to translate what they're being told. So there's a wonderful report called the Social and Moral Hygiene Report, which is commissioned by the Planning Commission. And the report is interesting because you see that many of these women politicians go and interview hundreds of prostitutes, clients, people who run homes around India. They come out with a very strong set of recommendations, but they constantly have these moments where there's an encounter where someone says, okay, we now want to sing for you. And the women who've gone to interview them have come to interview them as, oh my God, these are fallen, desperate women. And how do you react to this moment of like, and they sort of describe it, they say, we didn't know what to say. Or somebody else says, I earn much more than I would if I worked in a factory. So what are you going to do about it, right? So I think that's what the court allows it to make visible. So one of the critiques that the Husnabai case got at its time, and I've had conversations even today, is that how do we know it's her voice? How do we know it's not, say, some kind of pimp or broker who's speaking in her voice? And one can't answer this an authentic question or not. But the fact is that voice, when it appears, is a powerful voice because there isn't a clear answer or response you can give to it. And she's able to show that what she does is work, right? So it's not just, of course, it may be coercive, of course, it may be degrading, but for her, it is work, it is livelihood, and it's how she supports her family. And I was really taken aback by this one clause which says, okay, if you're a welfare state and you're not letting me do my work, I want compensation for the government for lost earnings, right? So it's remarkably contemporary document, as you point out. I think the other thing that chapter shows is, yes, the Supreme Court controls constitutional meaning, but only in a limited way. So in the 1960s, the court conclusively rules sex work is not protected under Article 19(1)(g). But irrespective of the court saying that, you have sex workers associations, unions constantly saying Article 19(1)(g) protects our right to enter our profession, right? So we are not going to be tied by the meaning that you give us, which I think made me think about litigation differently. That the purpose is not just to win a legal victory. The purpose is to allow for different kinds of politics.
Politics through voice and agency, and not just through votes and election campaigning. My favorite part of that chapter is how some of the prostitutes are heckling female politicians when they come and talk about saving the prostitutes from themselves and from trafficking. I want to ask you one last question about the book. The first time I read the book, I thought the title of the book should have been The State Squashing a People's Constitution. And the reason I say that is that all the petitioners that you talk about lost. You start reading about these people, you say, oh my God, they're fighting for their rights, whether it's the Parsis who may like a drink, or the honest prostitute, or the traders. And every single one of them, while they do weaken the state infrastructure and oppression in some marginal way, they all lose their case. And they all have to now find another way of going about their livelihood and lives. In some cases, like the Baglas, they also go to prison. And was that surprising to you that it's a people's constitution, but it's not really, because the powers that be are not giving people the power that the constitution was supposed to give them?
So I think I went in with a kind of even more pessimistic reading, and I came out of it feeling more optimistic. And I'll explain that in a bit, right? So I think one of the training I had to unlearn as a lawyer was that you always read a case to find out, okay, who wins and what was the best argument used, what is the precedent, let's distill that, right? I realized that a judicial litigation is just one part of a larger set of politics. So a judicial victory and loss by themselves have limited meaning. You could have cases where people have won, but that victory has not translated into sort of substantial change as well. So in many of these cases, the litigation allowed for the creation of larger associations. It allowed for a kind of public critique to enter the domain. So the prohibition policy was eventually overturned because of a series of litigations like this. Clearly, sex work has not stopped in India and continues in a variety of ways. Sex worker organizing continue to rely upon the law. The Essential Commodities Act was, again, more in breach than an actual following. I think that the Qureshi case, the Kausalda thing continued to the 90s, and I think that's the one which is the most difficult because it gets combined with extra state violence as well. So in none of the other cases do you have public vigilante groups trying to enforce these regulations, but by the 90s, in the Kausalda cases, you have non-state violence that's coming in, which is almost impossible to regulate through the systems. I don't see these as losses. I see these as ways of doing politics. And in some of the cases, the ways of doing politics are effective. In some of the cases, the victory is that you're able to get Sardar Patel in the tizzy. You're able to get the state to come before court. You're able to make the state lose revenue. Or maybe Husnabai's case, or one of these cases, you're just able to delay a matter for 8 years. So you're not evicted from your house, right? So these might seem to be like small victories for us, but for the people concerned, it's like a big victory, right? They didn't have to go to prison for 3 years at least. They were able to keep their house for a period of time. I think we need to, especially given the court system in India today, I think we need to think about how people engage with law as greater than just scoring a victory in the end. Partly because also, given how long cases take in India today, you're not going to see a victory or a loss for many years to come. So it's really what happens while you stay in the litigation process. I've been told my book is too optimistic. So you're the first person who's sort of told me that it's actually a pessimistic take on it.
Well, it's a pessimistic take in the sense that I am surprised by your optimism. I have always been a critic of socialism and this kind of state control over people's lives through economic matters. That's where I was really getting at, and I was devastated by the time I read the book. I said this is much worse than I imagined. I want to talk a little bit about modern day, this kind of a people's constitution in the modern day, and I want to bring up two specific parts. One is through litigation, and one is outside of litigation. So, in one sense, I feel like the courts have become less egalitarian now for many reasons. I mean, we had, of course, a public interest litigation wave in the late 70s and 80s. We had like Badua Mukti Morcha, Olga Tellis, so there was some representation of people who couldn't otherwise represent themselves. But the modern day PIL is all middle class people imposing their middle class morality. And you have justices, as Anuj Bhuvania has beautifully written in his book, who are just demolishing slums. Justice Sanjay Kaul talking about beggars on Tilak Marg being an eyesore. It's completely flipped on its head. In one sense, the imagination that loosening procedural constraints, which did get in the way of many people in the 50s and 60s, and relaxing these procedures might help people get better representation. And now we see the Supreme Court is just guarded by gatekeepers who are basically, nepotistic judges or nepotistically appointed judges and senior advocates, right? So there seems to be this cartelization. How do you see something like these cases playing out today? Of course, we don't have the same kind of industrial licensing, but we do have a lot of encroachment on people's lives. As you mentioned, prostitution has also extended to dance bars. Cow slaughter ban is now complete and extending to egg sales. Like, there is a lot of drift in these matters.
So maybe I just want to highlight, as a historian, like what is different about the time period that I'm looking at. And I think there are two or three major differences. So the first, of course, is that this is a new system where both sides are learning how to do this. So there's a strong element of uncertainty as people go into court. And what I found interesting in many of the judicial memoirs is that judges saying, we don't really know how to do constitutional law. I ordered some textbooks from America. I'm learning how to do this, right? Because their previous colonial training had very little engagement with judicial review. So this period of like open-endedness allows for different kinds of experimentation. Secondly, ironically, because there was no PIL, we had things that were closer to a class action suit. So Qureshi's are a great example of one. But in some ways, Hosnabai is also kind of, because there are multiple cases. It meant that you had to show representativeness. You had to show a kind of causal link. And in some ways, the kind of relief that you asked for was perhaps more connected to the community that is affected, right? So it isn't a self-interested interloper, a publicly minded interloper who's coming in, as a Freudian slip maybe, but really a kind of clear interest and link being articulated. And I think thirdly, and I think that's the one thing that gives me some degree of hope even today, is that in the 50s and today, the high courts are actually far more effective in addressing many of these questions and in providing relief. A sort of star litigant can get the case moved from Bombay to Delhi, whereas a less popular litigant gets stuck there. Recent empirical work on the Supreme Court shows that a significant portion of its docket is actually just Delhi and the NCR area. That should not be the case. Either the court should be hearing cases across India, or it should really be focusing on a small handful of cases of constitutional importance. So there is a kind of structural problem that has happened, which I think is more recent. So even in the 50s and 60s, the high courts are the real drivers of action. The Supreme Court is always conservative. In many of the cases, my litigants win in the high courts and then have the win watered down in the Supreme Court. And I think that's gotten really turbocharged in some ways today. The specifics of the cases, it was almost eerie when I was writing, because I sort of thought many of these issues were done and dealt with, but almost each of them reopened. And even commodity controls, if you look at the kind of debates around the agriculture bill, the use of commodity controls during COVID to like control PPE and variety of other things. So they remain the kind of backbone of Indian governance system. So I think I realized two or three things. One is, and this came across when I was looking at, when I was working in Bombay around 2010, there was a fresh PIL that was filed challenging the increase in drinking age by the Maharashtra government. And midway through the PIL, they discovered that actually the drinking age had already been changed 15 years ago, but they've just sort of forgotten about it. So it's a kind of performance. The second is that I don't think in the earlier period, a lot of these policies were, as I mentioned earlier, backed with kind of extra state violence. It was either hidden or sort of closely regulated. And I think that's really becoming visible in some ways with state like looking the other way in many places, which makes it difficult to discuss this as a legal issue, right? And thirdly, there's a kind of clear forgetting. So I was following the prohibition case that came out of Bihar, where Bihar enacted a law which is in some ways even worse than the Bombay presidency law that I look at. It's also very clear that the impact of the Bihar law has been disproportionately on poor people. It's been disproportionately on people drinking sort of local kinds of liquor rather than like elite forms of liquor. And it's a kind of clear forgetting of older policy struggles and things that have happened. And I wonder why that is. Is that a case of poor information given to the judiciary? Is it a case of sort of lack of institutional memory? Or maybe we should really be doing more history reading and history writing as a kind of public profession.
The case of the prohibition, of course, is, famously Bruce Yandel's public choice paper called The Bootleggers and the Baptists, right? Where you have these strange bedfellows. In India, it would be the case of the Thelewala and the Gharwali. If I had to make a similar comparison, where you have these strange bedfellows who come together who are to benefit from something. But as you pointed out, in Bihar, actually, I haven't calculated or compared per capita deaths and things like that, but you do have a lot more illness and death coming directly from this kind of adulteration. I want to step to another form of people's constitution. And here I'm referring to this lovely piece that you and your co-author, Dr. Surbhi Ranganathan, who's a professor at Cambridge, wrote for the New York Times. And this was, of course, in the context of the street protests by large numbers of, young people in India against the Citizenship Amendment Act combined with the National Register for Citizens. You had talked about how, once again, there is this resurgence of constitutionalism in public consciousness. How is this kind of protest constitutionalism different from litigation-enabled civil rights constitutionalism in a sense? It's very inspiring to see the preamble and Ambedkar's speeches on Article 14 being read, but not just in terms of the end goal, also in terms of form. How do you see this difference of people adopting the Constitution?
Well, thank you. I think a lot of us were taken by surprise when this particular form of protest emerged, and also somewhat overwhelmed because there's something really beautiful about watching a crowd of thousands of people sort of chanting this into the night. So one is that I think they need to go hand in hand, because you can't create a culture of lip service, recognition, respect of constitutionalism without a sense that the public really cares about this. And I don't mean it needs to be the kind of constitutional fetishization the Americans have. And I think it's interesting that, so even in my work, I find that there are multiple constituencies that engage with the Constitution, but the engagement is tied to a specific provision. So you have, for example, tribal communities that are organizing around autonomy and protections to tribal lands. You have Dalit groups that organize around certain provisions of the Constitution. You have artists and writers talking about freedom of speech. But what the CAA protest saw was a kind of invocation not of specific provisions or specific clauses, but really of the preamble, a largely outside of like school textbooks and stuff, neglected portion, and a kind of public oath taking around the preamble. And I was trying to find what's an example of this that I can find in the past. And the only thing that it could remind me of was from 26 January 1930, the national movement began celebrating that as Independence Day, and Congress would lead public processions in doing a kind of Swaraj pledge. And there was a wonderful newspaper story of, I think in 46, in the kind of 26th January pledge taking on Chowpatty Beach, where they have 5 sort of people on the dais, 2 women, 5 men, speaking in like Urdu, Gujarati, English, Konkani, Maharashtrian, Marathi, sort of all reading the pledge together. And it's really a kind of commitment to a set of ideals rather than specific clauses. It's a large enough canvas that allows to bring people to. And it's also, there are very few things that fall outside it. And in a way, it suggests that the project to change citizenship law is one of them, right? So it enables the creation of a larger coalition, which is not identified just with one group or one identity or one political party. We see this happening in other places around the same time. So I'm thinking about kind of protests and conversations in Chile, the kind of language around constitutional reform that emerged in Pakistan at a certain point of time. So I think this exists as a kind of vocabulary, but I think the Indian example took many of us by surprise, and both the intensity of it and the kind of range of people who participated in it.
My sense of one potential difference, and again, maybe I'm being a little too optimistic about this, is I feel like in modern day India, the courts have not been a counter-majoritarian court. Right? So really the only hope that the people have is to come out in large numbers and convince the majority that they are not as strong as one would believe that they are. So I thought of it as a slightly different, I mean, of course, this is not by design, right? People just spontaneously came together and they did this. So there is a symbolic element to it. But I think there's also an element of, it's very clear we're not going to get much traction with the courts. They haven't heard habeas corpus cases in a year, right? They haven't heard the election bonds cases for more than 2 years. I think Gautam Bhatia has a ticker somewhere on his blog along with the sexual harassment thing. So I thought that's where this is coming from, this failure to be counter-majoritarian.
And I think what has been striking, so as you pointed out, the two elements, right? One is that there is a sense that a lot of studies had shown that the Indian court, for all its failings, and it was rife with delays and a lot of problems even in the 90s and the early 2000s, but consistently in sort of public surveys, newspaper coverage, there is a wide degree of trust across political parties and across social constituencies given to the courts, right? And the sense is that the courts will either diffuse an issue by delaying it or create a kind of solution which will be acceptable to a large group of parties, right? So there were very few court decisions which were really deeply polarizing. And the ones that were often reversed following a kind of like self-correction. So I think that sense is under challenge for all the reasons that you suggest. I think that's not just because of what the court has been doing, but also because there's been a greater degree of transparency on the court's functioning because of new forms of reportage online, much more intense coverage and scrutiny. And I also think we've been very lucky to have a new generation of very young lawyers who are deeply committed, not just based in Delhi, who are willing to sort of talk and speak of these issues. And we often forget that India has one of the largest population of lawyers in the world. They're not all sort of amazing progressive radicals, but their presence means that there is a deep professional interest in maintaining the coherence of a legal system, right? You can't have a system where your skills as a lawyer have no value because all that matters is the kind of politics behind your case. The second bit, so one is this, has the court been ever counter-majoritarian? And I think the court's sense of it has always been, we are representing the real majority, right? Even in the PIL case, there's narrative we're doing that. And maybe in some ways, the protests are a way of signaling to the court that maybe the media doesn't represent what public opinion is, and we are able to represent this to you. And finally, I think it's interesting that it allows for new kinds of civic citizenship to be produced, one that is not reliant necessarily in participating. So I think this is the moment where actually a large number of marginalized people are really seizing on legality and the constitution is something that is on their side, right? And posing a kind of counter public to an official narrative on what the constitution should permit. And so the biggest contrast for me was while there were these protests going on, the government's intention to celebrate the constitution was to have a series of events on constitutional duties, which firstly are borrowed from the Soviet constitution and were also put in during the emergency under Mrs. Gandhi, right? So, and I'm all for promoting rational scientific temper, which is one of the duties. But it's interesting that that's what gets picked up on amongst the constitutional design thing.
Yeah, because their question is not what can we do to serve the public, but how the public can conform to our vision of, like a monolithic, is very similar to the moral and social hygiene cleansing. I'm very curious about your intellectual journey and intellectual influences because, as you mentioned, you were trained as a lawyer and then you switched to history when you did your graduate work in the United States.
I mean, like you, I was studying law in the early 2000s, and I was studying it at a particular point of time when, on the one hand, it was a moment where a lot of social movements had been successful in sort of litigating rights into the court. It was sort of Narega, RTE, new pensions law, forest rights, all of this was being enacted. But also you were having this emergent critique, and I think Anuj's work is a great example of it, which was critical of this kind of court-led social change, right? So on the one hand, we could see success. On the other hand, we saw this failure. I was fortunate to clerk at the Supreme Court, and my clerkship sort of showed me how difficult it was to access the court. So going to courts is not natural. It requires a great deal of will and resources. I also was fortunate in sort of being able to work in Sri Lanka at a time when Sri Lanka was trying to write a constitution to sort of resolve their conflict. It also showed me the kind of power of constitutionalism in popular politics. So when I first came to the US to study, I wanted to do sort of public law very traditionally within a law school. But I think it became increasingly apparent to me that a lot of what we take as concepts or institutions for granted have very particular histories in South Asia. And these are histories that need to be understood outside of just the kind of universal language of constitutional law. I think it was also a moment when there was deepening interest in history departments of histories post 1947. So I became aware this is even something that one could do. And I was, in terms of intellectual influences, I think I'd probably mention both my advisors who were very different in their own work. So one is Gyan Prakash, who's been a leading figure in the subaltern studies movement, who has in his work sort of really looked at how certain kinds of subaltern public exercise agency outside of universal domains of universal language, but has also been deeply interested in things like urban history. So he wrote a wonderful sort of account of Bombay in the 20th century. So made a lot of these struggles visible. My other advisor was Henrik Hartog, who is an American legal historian, but takes very seriously the idea that legal history is not just a kind of antiquarian search to find what was law in the past, but to get a sense of what did variety of people, whether like they're experts or ordinary people, understand the law to be, and how did they carry those meanings around as they navigated their daily lives. So some of his work was on how American men and women understood marriage and marital obligations over the 19th century. And I think that really the foundational figure for South Asian legal history has been Mitra Sharafi, who I think is the first lawyer turned South Asian historian who initially went to India to do a work on a history of contracts in India, and sort of just discovered that a lot of the commentaries on contracts and a lot of the lawyers involved in litigation were Parsis. And what she then turned to was writing a history of the Parsi community and the legal sphere in India and how they kind of constitute each other. So not only are modern Parsis sort of made through law, modern Indian law is shaped by specific sort of activities of the Zoroastrian community. So these are exciting times to both work on South Asian legal history. I mean, I think lawyers and historians have really turned to legal sources, but also to think of histories of India post 1947 and to sort of get over that mental barrier that, history ended. And there have been some books already, and I think there'll be many more books in the years to come that really focus on this period.
I mean, you've pointed out in your own work and the discussion today on how the more things change, the more they stay the same. Apparently now we're a market embracing, globalized economy, and we are still talking about price controls, quantity controls, import tariffs, prohibition, and, restrictions on prostitutes and dance bars and things like that. How do you write every day? What's your writing process?
So I think the biggest challenge for me when I was moving from the postdoc to a full-time teaching position was having to revise writing habits. So as a graduate student and as a postdoc, I had in some ways unstructured time. It would take me days to sort of build up writing energy, and then I would have a binge for 3 days where I would not sleep at night and would just churn things out and then revise. One is you don't have that kind of time to do build-ups anymore. And secondly, once you hit a certain age, you can't stay up all night and function the next day. So I think the sort of ideal move that I am always advised is create a system where you write every day. But this is something that I have rarely been able to do. What has worked has been to create writing groups with friends and colleagues where you set a commitment maybe every 3 weeks or every month that you'll meet as a group, and one person is responsible for producing a certain amount of written work for that. And that creates a kind of incentive. You don't want to disappoint your friends. And it's also kind of safe space to workshop. The other modification of this has been a kind of writing boot camp. So I did that more in the pre-pandemic world where a group of us graduate students and faculty would just sit in a classroom on a Saturday afternoon with a bunch of snacks and sit together in the room for like 6 hours and then just produce a chunk of writing. I have friends who've been doing this with Zoom and sort of doing Zoom accountability. That helps in that when you meet as a group, you sort of tell the group what your writing goals are at the end of 4 hours, 6 hours. You tell them how well you succeeded or did not. But it's basically about creating a system of accountability for writing. And I think the most challenging thing at this moment is, as a historian, is that what you can use to write is really dependent on what has been scanned and made available online. So I think I'm spending more time reading my sources than actually writing at this moment. I'm a tea and Diet Coke drinker rather than a coffee drinker. I enjoy music, but most of the music I listen to is very distracting, so I can't actually listen to music when I work. I have, as long as the weather has been nice, tried to go out and write in a coffee shop or in our campus has just put our tables and chairs all over. And I think that kind of change of scene has been helpful. Lots of breaks and snacks. I think that's basically the way to get through things.
You are also an artist. I am holding up a cover of Rohit's book, right now, and the cover will be up in the full transcript and show notes. And all the little figures in the cover art has been done by you. And here, you're basically representing the people of India, right? The magistrate, someone who's a sweeper, the trader, someone who's a dancer, right? Like, I mean, you have these beautiful little figures, and they look great when I just look at it. But when I look more deeply, they're really representative of the book.
I don't think of myself as an artist in any way whatsoever. This is just like many people going back to college days. I ended up doodling at the backs of notebooks. I don't have a great range. What I do draw are figures and scenes, and a lot of it is about detail of like architecture, furniture, clothing, right? So it's these people don't have faces; they just have these extraneous details. And I was struggling to come up with a cover for the book. I was working with a lot of images; none of them fit properly, and I was complaining to my mother about it, who said, "Just quit complaining and do something yourself." And I was lucky to be able to talk to the editor to get this put in. But I want to sort of maybe make a pitch for, as historians, we need to find a broader way to narrate our work. I find it deeply troubling that there's a lot of interest in South Asia in history, but the history that is read is either YouTube videos that are training people for civil service exams, or Amar Chitra Katha, or at worst, WhatsApp forwards, right? So, how do you communicate scholarly, grounded, complex historical narratives through non traditional forms of writing? And I think that's something, it's a conversation that I hope many more of my colleagues will be participating in. There are some podcasts which I think are great, but there have to be forms beyond podcasts as well, and in a more variety of languages as well.
No, I agree. The thing I love the most about the cover art, as you mentioned, there are no faces, but they're instantly identifiable by the outfit that they wear or the constable holding the stick and things like that. And, this again, it made me happy because I knew that you had drawn them and I had a smile on my face. But it also really depressed me in the sense that we've taken the individual out of the scheme in some sense. And we have made some of this about their group identity or their class identity, which I personally find very saddening because I feel like that has led to a lot of the chaos that we see in modern day India.
But Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who's always really astute in his observations, in a conversation about the book, sort of began with looking at a cover of Hobbes's Leviathan, right, where you have the figure of this man, and he's made up of lots of small figures, but they all look identical, right? So that's a story of a kind of like early liberal political text, but it's also a story of an imagined homogeneous male citizen, right? So I think the Indian context offers a different way of imagining politics, where the fact of your difference in identity should not preclude your ability to participate in a public domain with certain kinds of rights being protected. So I'm not, I mean, many people have argued this, another way of imagining what you might want to call it liberal, but another way of imagining what an egalitarian political future could look like. In some ways, maybe the Congress party would have liked all these figures to be wearing khadi and wearing kind of, standard staple clothing. Another kind of government might have wanted them to wear particularly traditional kind of clothing across the scenes. But what we have is a kind of diversity of representation. And I'm reminded of a couple of things. One was the kind of People of India posters, I'm sure you've seen, right, which were sort of sold as start papers for schools. But also the early petitions to the Supreme Court identified people by their communities as well. So it was from Nusarbanji Balsara, a Parsi resident of Kolaba, right? So it's very much part of their self-presentation. And so I wanted to sort of keep that in the picture.
By the way, just a random segue, were the headings of the chapters or the titles inspired by Sherlock Holmes in any way?
I talk a little bit about in my introduction. So I think they're influenced by sort of two kinds of readings. One is this legal bestseller model, right? Perry Mason, Sherlock Holmes, and there are a bunch of Indian lawyers, so K.L. Gauba and others who write these. They're very popular in the 40s and 50s. These railway bestsellers about, there's a famous one called Mrs. Tandon's Honeymoon and Other Stories, right? So they're essentially about these like stories of these cases. John Rumpole is another great favorite of mine. The second, of course, is the kind of logic behind common law, which is often taught through a series of case methods. So if you talk to a law student, I mean, as you know, right, everyone knows, the ginger beer wala case and the case of like the tram car and the woman with the baby. So there's a sort of way in which it's a sort of standard thing to common law. And I was trying to produce an alternative set of cases through which one can talk about these new developments. So
no, because then Husna Pai is your Irene Adler. That's where I was going with this. She's the one woman in this entire scheme of things, right? I have a couple of last few questions. One is, what are you reading right now?
I'm reading, well, okay, so there's work reading and there's reading for pleasure. So one of the courses I'm teaching this year is with my colleague Sunil Amrit, which is New Books in South Asian History. So this week we're reading a couple of books, one by Durba Mitra, which is called Indian Sex Life, which is really a kind of history about how a range of disciplines in the late 19th century began to really become obsessed with the idea of the prostitute. So from philology to forensic science to law to medicine, and it really sort of uses the kind of not the real figure of the prostitute, but the kind of the idea of the prostitute as constituting knowledge in social sciences in India. The other book of Jessica Hinchy is a really terrific book looking at the history of hijras in North India and how they were regulated by the state, by the colonial state, and how they continued to sort of persist despite efforts by the state to sort of mark them out as criminal and sort of push them out. In terms of non-scholarly work, my happy reading has been Suitable Boy, which is a book I turn to anytime like I need to go to bed. So you just read 10 pages. And I mean, of course, it's an incredible book, but it's a really beautifully detailed account of what India was in the 1950s. And we talked about this earlier. It's, whether you're looking for debates on constitutional law, conditions in the rural village, the nature of Urdu poetics, debates over syllabi in what should be taught in English departments, it's all there.
Land reforms and eminent domain cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So you will find it. So that's the kind of other fiction comfort reading there.
Have you also been watching it?
I did watch it over the summer when I was in the UK. I have mixed feelings, but it had some excellent moments. I'm still trying to find a way in which we are able to capture how Indians engage with the English language in a way that is natural and not sort of stilted and school drama-like.
And most important question during COVID times before I let you go is, what are you binge watching?
Okay, so far too much. A couple of shows that have been really interesting. One, of course, is Borgen, which is this sort of West Wing in Denmark. And it has problems in many ways, but the two things that are appealing, one is that in many ways, Danish political crises seem almost minor compared to the challenges the world is occupied with today. And it's nice to sort of find problems that are manageable and resolvable. And secondly, the Danish political system, at least to an outsider, represents a range of ideological visions that many of the other countries don't have. So you have parties that range from eco-greens and extreme left parties to extreme right parties to the ruling party, which call themselves the moderates. So I think just as an outsider watching that system, it's been far more relaxing than, say, watching something like the West Wing would have been. In terms of Indian shows, I recently finished watching Patal Lok, which was distressing, powerful, and disturbingly contemporary in its content.
One thing I should mention that both you and I would have a chuckle over with Patal Lok is that the police station is Outer Jamna Par, which is obviously a location that does not exist. But since both you and I have homes now that are Jamna Par, we know that that is a proxy for the distance from elites and powers that be and things like that. So I thought you would. Did you notice that? I thought you'd have a chuckle over that.
Of course, I noticed that. Yes. And also sort of what the imaginations of Delhi are, right? A lot of Jamna Par is actually closer to central Delhi than large parts of South Delhi are, but there's a sort of sense that it's beyond the river.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this, Rohit. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for playing out the time, and thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @SRajagopalan. And here is a sneak peek of my next conversation with Adam Orbach on development claims in slums in India.
After having spent a few years now engaging with these actors, surveying over 600 of them, not once have I ever heard one of these Basti Neta or slum leaders saying, I planned on moving to the city, moving to a slum settlement because I was aspiring to become a slum leader. This is something that happens after the dust of squatting settles. When these communities are first emerging, informal authority very quickly is crystallized. And because they're everyday residents, they're deeply embedded in the social and political networks of the village, but they possess some interesting qualities that differentiate them from sort of your rank and file residents.